In the last video, I talked about how to find a poem's rhyme scheme. This video continues our examination of poetry, this time by focusing on a poem's meter. Meter is defined as the rhythmic structure in a line of verse. It's possible to look for meter in all kinds of writing, but poetry in particular often consciously uses meter for some effect. The process of representing a poem's meter using some sort of marking system is called scansion. When we talk about meter, what we're really talking about is the ratio of stressed syllables to unstressed syllables in a line. A stressed syllable is a syllable that drives the word forward, whereas an unstressed syllable is just sort of along for the ride. In the word poem, for example, po is stressed and m is unstressed. In poetry written in English, we generally group syllables together as feet, and classify them based on the number of syllables in a foot and the order of the stressed and unstressed syllables. We generally mark stressed syllables with a slash or a caret, and unstressed with either an X or a breve. I'm going to be using the slash and X solely because they're easier to type, but if you do this for any length of time, you'll see the other marks used as well. Also, these aren't the only marks that are used, just the most common. If you want to spend a lot of time looking at different people's methods for marking poems, see the links in the description. Anyway, a foot of meter is simply a building block of meter that can be repeated any number of times to form a complete line. For example, if I had a foot that had 3 syllables and those 3 syllables followed the same pattern, stressed, unstressed, unstressed, I would say I had a dactyl. If I repeated that dactyl building block 4 times in a line, I would have a line of dactylic tetrameter, which would have 12 total syllables or 4 dactylic feet. Tetrameter means a 4-foot meter. See how that works? The most famous English language meter is by far Iambic pentameter. Breaking apart the name, we see that this refers to a meter built on iambs, which are defined as a pair of syllables that follow the pattern unstressed, stressed. Pentameter means that the foot is repeated 5 times, for a total of 10 syllables, half of which are stressed and half of which are unstressed. Iambic pentameter is so famous because some of the most famous works of the English language are written either wholly or partly in it. Shakespeare, for example, uses iambic pentameter throughout his works, as have many other poets who have written in English. So now that you have a basic idea of what meter is, let's pretend that you're given a line of poetry, say this line, and you want to figure out what its meter is. Just like we did in the video on rhyme scheme, we start by reading the line aloud, which I'll do now. And they shall fetch thee jewels from the deep. Here's where it gets a little dodgy. We're interested in finding the stressed and unstressed syllables, but we have to remember that they are stressed or unstressed in relation to the other syllables in the line. In other words, we have to be very careful that we don't mark something unstressed because it just doesn't seem stressed enough compared to the whole of the English language. We have to focus on the words around it and those words only. In this line, they, fetch, the syllable Jew, from, and deep are stressed. We can test this by reading it aloud again and putting emphasis on the stressed syllables. If the rhythm is disrupted for any reason, we may need to go back and reevaluate. Here's what it sounds like with emphasis. And they shall fetch the jewels from the deep. Sounds almost musical, doesn't it? Now that we've marked the stresses, the unstressed syllables are what's left. Those of you who are familiar with iambic pentameter have already realized that this line turns out to be iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter is so common in poems because most speech actually is iambic, and poets know that using iambic pentameter will mimic the natural speech patterns of most people. Let's try one that's a little harder. Robert Browning's A Toccata of Jalupis, which we talked about in the video on consonants and assonants, uses a really weird meter. Here's a line from the poem for us to analyze. Take a second, pause the video, and say the line slowly aloud. Did you notice that this line starts with a stressed syllable? Even if you were unsure, you could figure it out by reading it the other way, with the word as unstressed and the word for stressed, like this. As for. Doesn't really sound right, does it? So now we know that the line starts with a stressed syllable followed by an unstressed syllable. Now we just need to figure out the rest of the pattern. Let's read it slowly again and see if we can just continue that pattern. More often than not, the first few syllables will be the pattern for the whole line. What happens if we read it slowly and emphasize the stressed and unstressed pattern a little? It would sound like this. As for Venice and its people, merely born to bloom and drop. So it sounds like we might be onto something with the pattern. The only problem is that if we count up the syllables in the line, we end up with only 15. We see that the pattern we're following is the same stressed and unstressed pattern, which is called a trochee or a trochaic pattern. The only variation is the last foot, which is missing the unstressed syllable at the very end. This sometimes happens in poetry that is using a certain meter. To add variation and to keep it from being too terribly boring, the poet often chooses to omit a syllable from a line. This is usually called a Caesura, a term that music players out there will be familiar with. It literally just means pause, which is the effect it has on a poem. It forces you to pause for a beat. Caesura can happen anywhere in a line of poetry, and you can usually tell where one is when the rhythmic pattern gets disrupted by the absence of a syllable. In poetry, we usually mark a caesura with a double line. So now that we've gotten that down, we can add that syllable that got replaced by the Caesura with our other 15, giving us a total of 16 syllables in the line with a trochaic pattern. Since trochees are 2 syllables, we have 8 trochaic feet. An 8-foot line is called octameter, so we would classify this line as trochaic octameter. At this point, the only way to get better at this is to practice. I'm going to point out a link in the description that leads to an image which contains the most common types of poetic feet, as well as the names of the various numbered meters, which should help you get started on your voyage. You can download this image for your own use if you want. Remember that most poems use a combination of meters. Very few poets post-Shakespeare set out to have a poem follow a specific meter for the whole time. So don't be surprised when you find several different kinds of feet in a poem, or even in a single line. And don't get discouraged if you're terrible at this when you first start. This is, in my opinion at least, one of the hardest things about poetry. But you have to start somewhere. I hope this video was helpful, and if you still have questions, leave them in comments down below and I'll do my best to answer them. Thanks for watching. Cheers.